Welcome to MSP 1337. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, a show dedicated to cybersecurity challenges, solutions, a journey together, not alone. Welcome, everybody, to another episode of MSP 1337. That's right. It is that time, the Tuesday, third Tuesday of the month, Fireside Chat with the infamous Matt Lee of Pax8. Cybersecurity is not a calling, it's a passion. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Thanks, brother. Appreciate you having me back. I know at some point you'll validate parking, but I figured it's at least fun to come back every now and again.
We're not ever going to validate parking because if you had to pay parking for the chair you sit in, we both have problems.
Fair enough. Well, it's great to be back, man. I'm excited about this one because I think you and I were talking before we got started here. This one's so fundamental, right? Like, this is really, in my opinion, if you get this right, then even compromises that do happen are limited to the blast radius of that impact better and better, right? Like,
Boom.
if you can get authorization and principle of least privilege down to an understanding of saying, should Chris have access to this or not, based on his job duties, based on the things that make this necessary, that limits the blast radius when Chris gets compromised to only the things that should have been in his purview.
Let's let the audience know that, yes, in fact, Fireside Chat does not mean any control. It means that we're talking about a specific control. And this week, we're talking about access control management, Control 6 in the CIS framework, if you want to call it that.
See, Chris, for everybody that's listening right now, I just figured they're already so in tune to this. They already had surmised what I must have been talking about.
They're logically following along. Right. They need no preconceived labels. They know where we are.
No, they got this. And it was probably in the show title when you put it up, if I was candid.
Probably. We'll just say probably. I think so. As we kind of go through this one, this is one of my favorite. And the reason why it's one of my favorites now is I had the opportunity. This is also often referred to as PAM, privileged access management. Obviously, access control is what that's representing. But I had a chance to listen to Jimmy with CyberQP, and I'm drawing a blank. Help me here with Finn. They did an episode on PAM on their podcast. And I have to say, prior to listening to their episode, I was convinced that there are just a lot of vendors out there that are helping us solve for this control, that are competing with each other head to head as if my product is better than your product, you should use mine. And I had a real eye-opener listening, or maybe it was ear opener, listening to them talk about it, because the thing that Jimmy said that really stuck with me, he goes, there are multiple vendors, and he listed them, that he didn't list all of them. He listed some that, and he goes, in our space, in the solution provider space, catering to that SMB category. And he said, it's not so much that we're competing head to head, because we each have a unique approach to the PAM as a whole. We do some things very, very well that we focus on. And yes, in some cases, we have a bit of overlap on features. He goes, but the reality is, don't just go buy, say, my product, CyberQP, or go buy Auto Elevate or a product like that. He goes, figure out where your management strengths are as an organization before you decide which PAM tool to buy. And you know what that made me think about, Matt, is when you and I did at IT Nation Secure, and all the people in the room were talking about tools. So for those of you listening right now, this should not be, as we go through this, how to get to your cyber QPs or fill in the blank products. It should be, do I understand what PAM is all about and why access control management is so critical to being safe or safer in the context of reducing your blast zone as we go through the safeguards of this control?
Yeah, for sure. And pardon me if my audio breaks up. I've been having computer problems. If you know any good MSPs, send them my way. But when you think about this and you talk about access control, it really is about the data, right? The reason we have to go through 3 first and have classification of data and have classification of operations, as you and I've talked about, right? Access, things like that that matter. You have to understand what you have. And so when you go through 3, you get prepared for 5 and 6. 5 says, if you think about AAA, right? Authorization or account or I'm sorry, authentication, authorization, and auditing. If you go through those 3, control 5 really is authentication. It really is this Matt, which is partially why it's weird that in 6 we do find a lot of MFA, because you would think that's another attribute towards authorization, right? Because it is a second attribute about Chris, or I'm sorry, authentication. But they're adding it into 6 almost as if, and maybe I'll tease and Phyllis Lee like punch me next time she sees me. But I think they just forgot to put it in 5. If I'm really candid, I think having all those 3 controls on, or 3 safeguards on MFA in here, it really is something that should be part of authentication. And you can see, and you had said, and I talked about this before the show, you can see they're quite blended, right? 5 and 6 are sometimes hard to separate. But if we focus on the spirit of 6, 6 really is different methods of assigning access to data to a known identity. So if I've already done the authentication and you are Chris, what ways do I have to determine should Chris have access to this data? And when you get into it, it says establish, right? When we look at, 6.1, it says establish an access granting process. That may actually not be one linear one, right? You think about this, you might have things that are like, what do you call it? Discretionary access control, right?
Sure.
Where when you're talking about a Teams channel, for example, or our working group, Chris, where you're allowed to add me because discretionarily, you, the owner of that data, said you're allowed to access this data in this way. But at the same time, you might have mandatory access control. Right. Or attribute-based access control. And that's probably the only argument you could make, is that maybe MFA is an attribute towards the access of certain more sensitive things. And I could see that being the reason that MFA exists in Control 6, but it's just as much authentication probably as it is an attribute. But,
as we digress
when it talks about
so I want to throw something into the mix here, because as we go through CIS controls in general, obviously CIS does a great job of referencing either other frameworks or maybe even other guidance. For me, this one stands out maybe more so than any of the others that we've talked about thus far. And that is the reference that CIS makes to NIST 863. So for those of you that aren't familiar with all the NIST controls and safeguards, this is digital identity guidelines. And there are 4 very distinct pieces within that I think are important to just touch on, because I think when we go through this, what they're telling us is kind of a how-to in respect to like MFA on network, MFA on remote, some of those things, right? But what it doesn't say directly in there is, what are those digital guidelines or the identities that we're talking about in the context of doing this well? And so just throwing this out there, we're not going to dive into, NIST 800, but like enrollment and identity proofing, authentication and lifecycle management, and federation and assertions. So those are the 3 kind of things that you should be thinking about. And so if you're struggling with this one as you go through it, it's one thing to check the box and say, yeah, I've got MFA on that. But understanding why we're doing it can often impact directly how much money you're spending if you decide to just put MFA on everything under the sun versus what you actually need to put MFA on.
But at the same time, and Control 5 and Control 6, in my mind, are the first time where if you are looking to target IG2 or IG3, it really, really behooves you to look at those safeguards as you look at like 5.2, use unique passwords. Well, I don't have near as many unique passwords if I SSO everything in 5.6. Sure. Same thing in access control, right? If I'm trying to build out what access control methodologies I have, and let's say I'm going to go to each of my programs, I'm going to go to Zoom, I'm going to go to, whatever, my RMM, I'm going to go to each of those, look at each of those settings and what I can actually do versus, wait a minute, if you just SSO and skim, right, or JIT, right. So just for terms, skim is a provisioning methodology, JIT is just-in-time provisioning, but either way, attempt to try to grab group membership and then do something with those groups inside that receiving application, which means that you now, if you do 5.6 and 6.7, in those 2, in that attempt to centralize access control and centralize identity, then I have way less passwords. I have my access control in one unified plane where I can say, you know what? If you're going to sign in with to your RMM, I want you to be on a machine that's joined to Azure Active Directory, that's healthy,
Sure.
that's in its conditional state as positive through compliance, that's got everything we need to be able to secure and defend and protect as that threat actor makes an action. Then we can actually now say you can now access the RMM. But if you want to maybe access just your upcoming calendar in a web browser, and you're going to do that in a non-persistent state, I might allow you to do that in a machine that's maybe less posture ready from that perspective. Now, I say that with a bit of facility in the sense that I would not, but lots might. And so, the BYOD conversation is a tough one, but 5.6 or 5 in general and 6.7, which is access control, means that you can say now that is Chris, and Chris has access to the things, hopefully, that he should have access to, which is your principle of least privilege. That really is what plays out in 6, which is only assign Chris what Chris needs access to and no more. And it also follows a term in government or in the military, which is JIT-JIA, which is just in time, just enough access, right? And so when you think about those things, that's where PAM comes into play, is in that JIT-JIA side of things, which is I only need access right now, and then I need to de-escalate that access. And it needs to be tracked, and it needs to be traceable back to me, which is a lot of what you kind of opened up with about that conversation with Jimmy.
So
and in auto elevate.
So we did just like truly ping pong between 5 and 6.
Sure.
So let's excuse me, let's dive in a little bit. And I think it's good to talk a little bit about while they are unique, safeguards 1 through 3, they're really not. I mean, they're just talking about different places that you should do MFA. But the why I think is extremely
1 and 2.
Yes, fair.
Yeah, you're being 3, 4, and 5. Sorry, for MFA.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so we've got 1 and 2 is obviously the granting and revoking process. But and I don't know, do we really need to go deep in there? I think this gets into like role changes of a user. What's the process for granting that? I think
it does, but it does matter, and here's why it does matter. When you think about 6.1 says establish an access granting process, 6.2 says establish an access revoking process. And it does say in there immediately upon termination, rights revocation, or role change of a user. Here's the way we used to handle this, Chris. When we get fully centric on 5.6 and 6.7, when I am centralizing as much as possible into one IDP,
you're also reducing the footprint if you followed 1 and 2.
True story. But if you look at 1 and 2 and you now say, Chris, if your title right now is in charge of cybersecurity programs at CompTIA, and you also are in charge potentially of the trust mark, then those might be attributes that your title grants you access to dynamically into a group that then when you change to a different role and no longer need purview of that prior role, the title change automates a group change that removes you from the one that gives you access and adds you to the one that you need access to. And as you start looking at that kind of stuff, you can see that in order to do 6.2, it's even done easier if you're automating that. If you're doing things, whether you're using Roost or internal automation, whatever it may be, to automate that process. Yeah. And so, the highest form of a safeguard is automated in the most part. But anyways, I didn't want to discount that revocation, because if you look at it, that's a lot of times how people get nailed. They gave some vendor access to some system forever ago, and all the way back to 5, when it says keep a list of accounts, keep a list of dormant accounts, disable dormant accounts, all those things. We also need to remove access from those accounts so that if they do get compromised, they do not actually compromise the data anymore. And so you do have to have a revocation process. Like I'll beat that drum till death on that regard. So anyways, but back to your point though, on continuing on past 6.1 and 6.2.
Okay, so and the part that I was talking about as far as like reducing, this is one that we've talked about even on the access or account management side, right? This is one that we talked about when we've done our sessions, and that gets into, you might not be able to delete an account. You might not be able to disable an account based on certain policy rules because of the role they play within your organization, like backups or something along those lines. But one of the things I will say that I need to emphasize, because I think as an industry we've gotten sort of laissez-faire or lazy with this one, is especially when you're in Active Directory, like make sure that you're writing some really good descriptors inside the container for that user, so that someone's not like, I wonder if that's like all-in backup, I think it is. Or is it like a third-party support person that needed to log in one time, and that account absolutely should have been disabled? I've seen really good name conventions for like a user type, like this is like fill in the blank vendor backup as an example. And then when you ask questions about that user profile, they can't tell me if it was because they had a support call with the vendor or if that's the one they actually used for doing the backups. So just a little pause there for a moment for those of you like, hey, here's a little Easter egg for you in case you don't listen to the whole episode.
And if you weren't listening, I thought Chris was going to Laissez Le Bon Temps Roulette. I thought we were heading down to New Orleans or something.
Started out with maybe not till like the end of November.
Okay, good.
All right. Anyways, so we've got
so the other No, I was going to say the other piece of this we talked about is all the MFA pieces, and I don't want to understress that. It says anything externally exposed. Well, guess what? What are your SaaS applications? Those are externally exposed, aren't they? Like by their very nature, that's kind of how this works. And so when you think about that, don't forget about any of your SaaS consumption that you're using, right? And it also goes on to say in 6.3, enforcing MFA through a directory service provider or SSO provider is a satisfactory implementation of this safeguard. And so it really does go very hard in the paint to say, if you're using SSO and that SSO presumably has conditional access or MFA of some form or fashion, whether it be cryptographic, whether it be a push notification, right? And don't forget, when I talk about cryptographic, Windows Hello, storing it on my TPM and having physical presence of that TPM and access to that TPM, along with TPM hammering protections, is actually a very viable methodology for providing a multiple factor to say that I'm still on this actual device. This is still me. Nobody was hammering against it in the library and destroyed my cryptographic key in the TPM. So when we talk about 6.3, don't forget about all of those other applications as well, and access to machines, access to desktops themselves, in my mind, especially as they travel. It's not specifically called out here, but definitely a crucial aspect and shows up in a lot of other safeguards and controls.
So question, going back to what you said about external apps. And I think there's the definite intention behind it being literally the first one in here after establishing, authentication and revoking processes in 1 and 2. I would argue that this is almost paramount today. Go back 10, 15 years, external applications were almost hard to define, right? Like, because we didn't really have them in the way we do today. Like Amazon was an external app 10 years ago. Facebook, of course, those are all external apps. But we largely didn't build our businesses on online applications like we do today.
Yeah, they were mostly in the internet, right? They were mostly internal, especially early on. But yeah.
So I just think it's important
in the corporate net.
Yeah. So my thought process on this one was, and why I wanted to sort of emphasize it again is just assume external in your approach. Like, it might not be, but if you assume external in your approach, you're going to save yourself a lot of headache when later on you go, oh, wait, that is an external app. And now you're trying to explain to the staff why you've suddenly had to change a protocol or a authentication method that's now inconveniently one more step than they're used to. And it wouldn't have been if, I'd rather have you walk something back than have to walk something forward.
Well, and you think about it, if you're talking about those, internal corp net, everybody's had them, right? Your Sage 100 or your all these different things that are not specifically in 6.3. They're not traditionally extended to be externally exposed. And in your mind, you're like, well, they're covered for by the VPN when you start thinking about MFA for remote access. That's not necessarily true. In fact, MFA for remote access got MFA'd and remote access to the Cisco guy, or I'm sorry, to the, I think, I don't remember which specific breach, but got in from the machine on that same VPN tunnel from that machine that was validated. So you can't just look at it that way. But what I would look at it as is think of things like what Azure can do, and even Cloudflare, if you're wanting to look at outside of Microsoft, that allows me to authenticate and then use MFA to validate on me to touch an internal application because it now has to tunnel through Cloudflare, right? So it's a change in that internal server that now says, oh, are you still on Matt? And AD can go, wait a minute, are you still on an Azure Active Directory joined device and still healthy and still all the stuff we talked about before? And then, yes, okay, we'll let you in now because of this, right? And so you can make, situations where, what if that threat actor was stumbling on internal resources and then hit one they weren't authorized for, or then hit one they weren't in the right user context for because they were at home that the user would have never done, right? Things like that. You can start finding that threat actor now because of those mistakes. In fact, that's how Dragos did it, right? The threat actor came in, was hired before hire. It was a threat actor. And then they started poking around at resources. They said, wait a minute, this is not the normal user behavior, right? Or WEBA, user and behavior analytics. But the point is, I think using MFA, you can do MFA down all the way at the application layer, not just in a VPN or not just in a third-party application where they support it. And you can tie that all back to a single sign-on provider, bringing us all the way back down to 6.7 and 5.6 yet again. And then you get into, 6.4 says remote, MFA for remote network access, which we just kind of covered, MFA for admin access, right? And this is saying for all administrative access accounts, we're supported on all enterprise assets, whether managed on site or through a third-party provider. And if you go look at the cloud guidelines that goes with this, that's also true, right? Protect those admin accounts. And I think this is so
let's
critical.
Make a note of that real quick.
Azure,
for those of you going through this that are focusing on CIS, don't forget that there are companion guides published by CIS to go alongside the sort of the core of the top 18 that give you a different perspective or look at this through a different lens when you're looking at things like cloud. I believe they have one for like BYOD or mobile as well. Mobile, I think mobile one is really important too, because it was almost like they wrote it before we had like portable devices. Like, oh, if you're not carrying your desktop around, you got something that can fold up and go in your backpack. Like, but as you read through it, you realize like, wait a second, they maybe didn't encompass everything that they could have. But the reality is, and I just saw this the other day, I don't know if you saw, but HP just released their new 17.3 inch what they call a foldable computer. Like, they're not even calling it a laptop. It's just called a foldable computer. But it weighs less than 4 pounds and it has 2 batteries in it. So I'm like, but for those of you that are interested and you think that might be something you're interested in purchasing, I believe MSRP is $5,000. So I don't know about you, but carrying around a $5,000 laptop to get on an airplane, I'm a hard no, because odds are I'm going to end up needing another one by the time I get to my destination because some Yahoo stepped on it.
For sure.
All right, so we have a few. We've gone through the safeguards. We can emphasize that, hey, if you're just doing IG1, I get it. That still puts you through. There's only 3 left for 2 and 3. And I think when I look at this, and as I think about solution providers, this is one of those controls where I would argue that IG1 for a solution provider is not enough. And the reason being because as a company, what you do for your clients, if you don't have handle on the latter 3 safeguards, this is tough.
But let's just be completely honest to why this is not a barrier to entry. Every single one of you is using Azure Active Directory as a core tenancy of their Microsoft tenant, or Google as a core tenancy of their Google Apps tenant.
Like, you already have
most
it in
of
place.
You, hopefully, if you're listening to me, right, you've already got it. You could do the work. You could actually just find a way to automate and do the work. And what's so interesting about SSO cutovers is the biggest barrier to entry is, first off, financial. I'll put that out there. We haven't even talked about SSO.tax. But the biggest, go check that out, SSO.tax. It's a public doxing of companies that's technology is so terrible that they had to put a price tag on top of the bare minimum work it would take to integrate some crappy ass authentication authorization platform or build it themselves. And therefore they charge exorbitant amounts of money for anybody that wants to upgrade. Like, for example, one went from $2,500 a year for us at our former MSP to, I think, $27,000 a year. Right. And so for that same software, just to get SSO, my rant aside, you should definitely start down that path where it is possible for those softwares that do already offer it. For ConnectWise Home, you can connect in with your SSO platform and touch most of ConnectWise vis-a-vis that single identity provider. You can do the same thing for a lot of other players. Pax8, you can sign in with single sign-on by Microsoft. And when you get good at that, what's interesting is those cutovers become so easy to do. You do it once for a customer, you start documenting what happens. Some of the key things you don't realize are like, The users might not still be the same user objects. It might generate new user objects, or if there's a mismatch in the email, it might have to do a bunch of email work first to get everything correct for the user principal name. Sometimes software doesn't always use UPN. Sometimes they'll use instead, the email address instead of the user principal name. And so you just have to get good at that. But once you document it, it's really scalable and it's really easy to do. And there's just no excuse not to do 6.7 and 5.6. If you're a solution provider, or if you're just a business, there's just no excuse anymore. Even if you're running hybrid, that's not any more expensive to run hybrid and have that capability, as much as I hate it, right? There's just so many reasons, Chris, that I'll stand up on this hill with this sword forever, that there's no reason you're not doing proper control 5, 5.6, and 6.7.
So 6.8, and we can wrap up with 6.8. I think this one's a little bit more difficult. And I think part of this is like, whatever you do, don't take away my admin rights to my local machine because I'm your engineer. Don't make me be unable to do my job, as an example. But I also think this is...
And that happened in 5.3 though, right?
It did.
Use administrative accounts.
It absolutely did. But I think good point. When it comes up here, I think this is a little bit different approach. So in this case, this is like, we've already established that you should or shouldn't have local admin rights to your machine, right? But in this safeguard, what we're really saying is, are the people within your organization or whoever you're doing this for, are the privileges that they have today appropriate for their job role as they might change job roles throughout their time in your organization? And in this particular case, I think it's an interesting one to call out, say, CMMC. And the reason I say that is thinking about, just as an example, thinking about enclaves and trying to protect certain data types, maybe even just for a certain project. If you're not doing this on a regular basis, you are likely going to compromise your roles and privileged access to certain things because you are not
from an enclave access perspective.
Correct.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting about 6.8 too is it's a bit myopic because if you read it, you just see RBAC. I'm only doing RBAC. But there are attributes and reasons to do ABAC. There are reasons to do discretionary. There are reasons to do mandatory access control. There are reasons to follow these others. This is a good one to say basically what the spirit of this is making sure that the people have the right access rights necessary for the role they're doing at that time. What makes that even more unique for service providers is they're often wearing lots of hats and they're wearing different roles. Absolutely. You don't want this to always exist, which is why PAM is so useful in this, where you would escalate. But I don't want to get off the point of the way we did this was we had roles, and that role was, let's say, a sysadmin on Team Alpha in Dallas. That was in your title. You were a Dallas Team Alpha sysadmin. I was able to parse that and put you in the appropriate groups. And that group had whatever access it needed to have. In this case, we were talking about principle of least privilege around access of different clients, groups of clients. In fact, that's the whole reason I got so involved with GDAP early on, right? And building GDAP with Microsoft and helping advise on that, is that I wanted to have these groups. I wanted to limit it down so that if Johnny got compromised, I only had 6 clients suing me, not 697.
I mean, this is almost like, this makes me think about like VLANs and network segmentation, right? Like, because that's incorporating into what you're having to do.
Of humans and access. Yeah. And so what we ended up doing as well, though, is we realized that just saying you're a sysadmin meant that we were limiting some other things. And so we wanted to do things to escalate that. Well, we came up with an ABAC method where we said, listen, if you're a 1, it indicates to us you only have access to your pod, and that's what you should have access to. If you are a 2, you might now have access to another pod because you might help another team out. You might do some of those things. If you're a 3, you may have global access to one org, but the only people that can assign 1 through 3 would be the general manager in that org. If you wanted a 4, which meant now you had access to multiple orgs, you had to go through a security team. We had to escalate the conditional accesses around your systems. We had to put in additional protections to meet that escalated risk and capabilities, right? And so we had that would have to be approved by me, essentially, at the end of the day, or Matt Topper, right? And then when you got into maybe past that, a 5 was God access. Nobody had that, not even me. You would even escalate into that if you had it. It would be temporary. It would be very well tracked. It would be very well watched. It would be all those things. And so, like, what's interesting about this is don't get lost in just trying RBAC. The spirit of it is trying to make sure that Chris has the access to what he needs when he needs it. And Chris as a target is only valuable for whatever asset's going to die by him touching it. Therefore, you want to limit the amount of those as much as possible. And if you can do that in a role-based way, it's very reasonable. It's easy to explain. Why did Sally, the janitor, have keys to all the rooms? Because she has to clean all the stupid rooms. That's a risk we have to take. Right? Like, you get into that point where it's that same understanding of showing thought in this, Chris, is probably all I really care to see is that you're actively thinking about and doing this,
It's the
right? In that way.
intent behind which we approach it, not always necessarily the outcome.
Yeah, that's reasonableness by definition, man. You're
That's
never going
right.
to win. Threat actors are always going to win.
So
How do
there
you
you
show the
have
best
it.
work?
There you have it. We've gone through Control 6. Hopefully it wasn't too painful. Before I let you go, talk to me a little bit about your latest cooking scenario that you did, because Wayne Selk called out and said, man, I saw this post by the infamous Matt Lee and said,
Oh,
man,
my potato, my, my potato soup.
your potato soup. I think it was your potato soup. And he said, I was quite impressed with the potato soup skills of his words were mad cooking skills.
You know what? A long time ago. So I'm a little bit on the spectrum. I know it's hard to believe, but
And you never look at me with both
like cutting
eyes.
things in. That's unrelated. That's unrelated. But I love cutting things into tiny, small, uniform things very fast. I really enjoy knife work, and so I do love doing all the prep. But Kat is the chef, so she did all that. I'm sous chef. I just cut up the bacon, which, by the way, helpful trick. If you ever want to cut up bacon in tiny squares, put it in the freezer about 17 minutes. Well, 17 minutes in the freezer, and you can cut it as one uniform block, and it doesn't fall apart, and you can cut it real fast. Scissors are a pain in the butt. You got to sit there and cut
fair
forever.
enough.
But
freezer
no, yeah, freezer people, it's a win. No, man, we love to cook when we're home. We're not home often, but we made soup, and it was about 4 gallons of soup is what we ended up making.
Lord,
5 pounds of potatoes.
Your dogs need to. You out of dog food too?
You know what's funny is the kids eat that in like it was 3 days, 4 days. It was all gone. Every bit of it.
I can relate. My wife made beef barbacoa, and I think I got one taco out of it, or maybe 2. Well, I want to make sure people can get back to their day. For those of you listening, thanks and have a great week.